Welcome back. This is session 3, Confident Faith, Apologetics for Everyone. In previous sessions, we saw how people's heartfelt concerns and objections about Christian faith are usually motivated by one of 3 primary questions. Is it true? Is it good? Or
does it work?
Last session, we began with the motivating question, is it true? Asking, is God true?
And in this session, we'll be asking, is Christianity true? Because even if people find the evidence for the existence of God compelling, the follow-up question will naturally be, but why believe it is the Christian God?
For Christians, the primary answer to that question is because of Jesus. Because if God exists, the next question becomes, has he spoken? And the Bible answers that question with a resounding yes, he has spoken to us, and most clearly in Jesus.
I sometimes meet people who are surprised to discover that Jesus was a real person. A lot of people assume he's some sort of mythical figure or legend, but as far as historians are concerned, the fact that Jesus really existed is non-contentious.
Even biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, who is not a Christian, writes that virtually every scholar of antiquity, of biblical studies, of classics, and of Christian origins agrees that Jesus existed.
So when someone asks, why believe God is the Christian God? This is a question that naturally leads us to consider the evidence of history. This really is one of the things I found surprising about Christian faith, as someone coming from a completely non-religious background, to discover that its claims could be objectively investigated because it makes claims about what God has done in history, and because history can be objectively investigated.
However, 2 big questions that commonly arise with respect to the Bible's historical claims about God and Jesus Christ are, firstly, why trust what the Bible says? And secondly, how can we believe in the resurrection in particular? How can we rationally believe in someone rising from the dead?
So firstly, let's consider the question, why trust what the Bible says?
Well, a common objection along these lines is that the Bible is nothing more than a book of myths or fairy tales. However, one has but to read about Jesus in the Bible to discover that this is no fairy tale. Because whereas fairy tales usually take place once upon a time and in a land far, far away, Jesus lived in a place we can visit at a time in history we can study.
Whenever I'm speaking to someone in London who thinks the Bible is pure fiction or fairy tale, I like to invite them to go on one of the regular Bible tours that operate in the wonderful British Museum to discover the way in which many well-known archaeological findings have confirmed historical descriptions in the Bible, as well as the way in which historical descriptions in the Bible have often led to amazing archaeological findings.
Whatever might be the average opinion on the street about the Bible's historical reliability, scholars working within the academic disciplines of history, archaeology, and textual criticism do not treat the Bible as pure fiction or fairy tale.
One of the common objections you might face regarding the Bible's reliability is the claim that the Bible has been changed or corrupted over the centuries.
You might hear this from, say, a skeptic or from followers of other religions that have spun off from the Christian tradition, such as Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, or Islam.
Or they've been reading Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code or something like that. But the reason why historians are so certain that the text hasn't been corrupted over time is because of the huge amount of manuscript evidence that we have in support of its reliability. You see, historians assess the transmissional accuracy of historical documents by looking at the number of ancient manuscripts that we have of it, as well as the dating of those manuscripts. And basically, the more manuscripts we have, and the closer the dating of those manuscripts are to the original, the more accurate the text. And what we discover is that the New Testament in particular has more manuscripts and more early texts than any other comparable work of antiquity, with basically no gaps in the chronological record. And that's because right from the beginning of the early church, the books of the New Testament were written and then copied many, many times and distributed all over the known world to far-off Christians so that they could read them as well. Without any centralized planning control, it just happened organically. And so copies of the manuscripts proliferated exponentially like bunny rabbits breeding.
That's right. The only comparable ancient document that even comes close in terms of manuscript copies is Homer's Iliad, with just under 2,000 manuscripts. And the oldest surviving manuscripts date from at least 4 centuries after the date it was written.
Whereas for the New Testament, we have about 3 times as many New Testament manuscripts in the Greek alone, nearly 6,000, as well as another nearly 19,000 manuscripts in other ancient languages. And not with a gap of 400 years or more between the original and the earliest manuscripts, but of less than a century for most of the New Testament books.
And what's more, even if we had 0 manuscripts, almost the entire New Testament could be reproduced just from quotations of the early church fathers.
Which is pretty cool. Because of this, critical scholarship is certain of the accuracy of 99% of the New Testament text now, and the remaining 1% is minor detail that doesn't affect anything major or theological. In fact, historian and textual critic Ben Witherington has remarked that we're closer to the original text of the New Testament now than any time since the first couple of centuries. So good is the scholarship.
So overall, if one were to reject the transmissional reliability of the New Testament, then they would also have to reject the reliability of many writings of classical literature, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning.
Being confident that what we have today is an accurate transmission of the original document doesn't mean that someone might not have objections about the original. So how do we respond to the question of whether the original itself was historically reliable?
Well, with respect to the New Testament manuscripts, the short answer is that we have good evidence to believe that the original manuscripts were historically reliable for a number of reasons. But for the sake of time, let's just share with you 2. Firstly, the very early dating of the originals.
Many people think that the New Testament was written centuries after Jesus and that it's therefore probably inaccurate or at the very least embellished. However, most scholars date the Gospels as written from within only 25 to 55 years after Jesus' death. Some scholars, such as British New Testament scholar James Crossley, believe Mark was written 10 to 20 years after Jesus. Paul's writing, which makes up much of the New Testament, was written about 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death. And in some of his writing, Paul quotes Christian creeds about Christ's death and resurrection, which scholars now recognize were in existence within just a year or 2 of Jesus' death.
The early dating of the New Testament then makes it highly unlikely that the events of which it speaks are completely fabricated.
Right. Imagine if Tash and I were to write a wildly inaccurate account of the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, claiming all sorts of weird things, like it fell because of the, let's say, the direct military influence of the Australian Army and its crack team of riflemen riding on the back of kangaroos. Why would no one believe us? Well, not only because, well, who can imagine such a weird military tactic, but also because, more seriously,
the fall of the Berlin Wall happened in 1989, and there are many people still alive today who were there and who can remember what actually happened.
Right. Fabricated historical accounts have little chance of getting off the ground, particularly when there are plenty of people still alive at the time of their publication who can testify that what is written is not the way things happened. Which is why historians get really excited about historical documents, such as the New Testament, when they are written during the lifetime of the events that took place. It speaks very powerfully to their reliability.
The second reason we have a good reason to believe in the original manuscript's reliability is their correspondence with extra-biblical sources.
If we were to consider the work of non-Christian extra-biblical historical writings, like those of Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, or the Talmud, we would ascertain the following historical facts. That Jesus was a Jewish teacher who lived in the 1st century, who was revered as wise and powerful, a performer of miraculous feats, that he was brought to the authorities and crucified under Pontius Pilate on the eve of Passover, and that Jesus' followers believed he was the Christ or Messiah and worshipped him as God, refusing to worship other gods even on pain of death. In other words, we still get a solid picture of the biblical story historically, even without Christian sources. Of course, there are many ancient Christian sources of information about Jesus as well, corroborating with what the Bible has to say.
And on top of correspondence with other historical documents, you've also got correspondence between the New Testament's descriptions of things like customs, living conditions, topography, botany, place names, people's names, furniture, tools, roads, coins, and buildings with what we know of that time through detailed archaeological research and discovery.
Let us give you two examples. In John chapter 5, it speaks of a pool in Jerusalem by the sheep gate called in Hebrew Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. Now, until the 20th century, there was no evidence outside of John's Gospel for such a place, and some critics questioned the Gospel's reliability. But then in the 1930s, the pool was uncovered by archaeologists, complete with 4 colonnades around the edges and 1 across the middle.
As the archaeologist William F. Albright observes, many modern archaeological discoveries have established the accuracy of details in different biblical narratives and have brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history.
Another example comes from a practice in Jesus' day in which people used to bury the bones of their loved ones in a box called an ossuary with an inscription of the person's names. And in recent years, archaeologists have put together a complete catalogue or database of thousands of the names of real people who lived and died around Jesus' time, based on the names that archaeologists have discovered in ossuaries, as well as on papyrus inscriptions and other written documents.
So we can now ask what percentage of people were named Simon,
Which would have been a good choice, because it's a good name.
That's right. Simon, or Joseph, or Judas, or Mary, and the database can tell you. And scholars have discovered that if you compare the popularity of names in the Gospels and Acts with the information from the database, the percentages that we have from the Bible match the percentages that we have from the database, and uncannily so.
Which is hugely significant if we bear in mind that, of course, the Gospel authors would not have had access to this survey data, and nor would it have occurred to them that historians in the 21st century would one day check these sort of details using a digital database. The fact that the New Testament is so reliable with respect to background details such as these, which they had no reason to believe that people would be scrutinizing with a fine-tooth comb, this gives us confidence that they are reliable with respect to the important matters as well.
So now's a good place for us to press pause. We've discovered why we have good reason to trust both the transmissional accuracy as well as the historical reliability of the Bible. Take some time now to think about and discuss why this matters, both for your own faith and for conversation about your faith with others. Welcome back to the second half of session 3.
So, having considered the general historical reliability of the Bible, let us now consider one of the more controversial claims that the Bible makes, one that some people have a very hard time swallowing, even if they're willing to grant that the Bible is in many respects historically accurate and reliable, and that is the Bible's incredible claim that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. As the objection is sometimes put, how can we believe in the resurrection?
Christians believe the reality of our faith stands or falls on the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 14, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith.
But of course, belief in the resurrection is something skeptics like to point to as an example of the sort of irrational things that Christians believe in.
A few months back, I was on holidays with my parents in Barcelona, and we went on one of those sightseeing tours. Now, over lunch, I was sat next to an older gentleman, and as what often happens when people discover what I do for a living, the conversation got on to Jesus. And the resurrection was this man's very objection to Christianity. He really liked Jesus and what Jesus had to say, but he could not accept Jesus' resurrection from the dead. He said it was too far-fetched to believe. Interestingly, though, he did entertain the idea of aliens. So make of that what you will.
So how can we respond to the claim that belief in the resurrection is irrational? Is there actually any historical evidence that we can point to in support of the resurrection?
Well, as it turns out, there is.
The strong majority of historical scholars, whether Christian, atheist, agnostic, or otherwise, acknowledge the following minimal or bedrock facts about Jesus Christ.
1. Jesus died by crucifixion during the Passover in Jerusalem in AD 30 or 33.
2. His tomb was found empty a couple of days later by some of his female followers.
3. His disciples genuinely believed the risen Jesus appeared to them on a number of occasions over the next few days and weeks.
4. James and Paul, who were skeptics, were converted because they genuinely believed the risen Jesus appeared to them also.
And 5thly, the early church exploded in numbers soon after Jesus' death.
Investigating the case for the resurrection then involves an assessment of which of the available hypotheses or explanations makes most sense in light of the evidence. That is, in light of these remarkable bedrock facts.
Of course, if the resurrection happened, it explains the evidence perfectly. So the question to ask is, are there any plausible alternative explanations for the evidence on offer? Any alternative hypotheses that might explain these minimal or bedrock facts?
Well, if Jesus really didn't rise from the dead, then it means that his disciples who said that he did were either deceivers, deceived, or deluded.
So, could the disciples have deceived everyone? Well, no, because as we said, historians unanimously agree the disciples sincerely believed they saw a risen Jesus, even if they cannot explain why they believed that.
For example, historian Paula Fredrickson, who's not a believer, states, "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian that they must have seen something."
Moreover, if the resurrection was a complete fabrication, it's very unlikely the disciples would have chosen to invent an account of the discovery of the empty tomb by women, because the testimony of women was not considered reliable in Jewish or Roman law. That was an unfortunate reality of the times.
But secondly, and even more compellingly, the disciples refused to back down on their claim that Jesus had risen from the dead, even after they faced terrible persecution. And nothing proves sincerity more than martyrdom, say historians. And we possess strong historical evidence that certain key eyewitnesses were martyred for their faith. Peter, for example, was crucified, James was stoned, Paul was beheaded. In other words, the disciples had nothing to gain by making up a lie about Jesus' resurrection, but everything to lose, including their reputation, friendship, social standing, and even their own lives.
Then what about the second option? If the disciples weren't lying, could they have been deceived? Well, you have to ask who would want to deceive them. Not the Romans. They wouldn't have wanted to create a legend that would challenge Rome's authority in an already politically unstable area. And not the religious leaders. They wanted Jesus dead because he was challenging their religious authority.
Perhaps Jesus himself deceived everybody and didn't really die. This was for a time a leading alternative theory, that Jesus merely swooned or fainted on the cross, revived himself in the tomb, rolled the massive stone away, somehow slipped past the Roman soldiers guarding the tomb, and then convinced his followers that he had risen from the dead when in fact he'd only fainted.
The practical impossibility of this theory reminds me of a humorous story of the boy who submitted the following letter to a Q&A forum of a magazine. He wrote, "Dear sirs, regarding Easter, my teacher says that Jesus just swooned on the cross and that the disciples nursed him back to health. What do you think? Sincerely, Tommy." The reply was this: "Dear Tommy, I suggest you take your teacher and beat him hard. 39 times with a cat of nine tails whip, then nail him to a cross and hang him in the sun for 6 hours, then run a spear through his side into his lungs and put him in an airless tomb for 36 hours and see what happens. Sincerely, Charles.
In other words, the swoon theory has been discredited in modern times as going against the weight of historical evidence, including what we know about the thoroughness with which Roman soldiers knew how to make sure their crucified criminals really were dead, otherwise they may have ended up in trouble or dead themselves, and also as going against the weight of modern medical knowledge, including the way in which the flow of blood and water from Jesus' side would have been indicative of a buildup of pericardial and pleural fluid in the membranes around the heart and lungs, itself a symptom of severe blood loss and thirst. Even if Jesus had somehow merely swooned, despite all that's just been said, he would have been in a state of horrendous disfiguration and trauma. In other words, hardly a picture of a miraculous resurrection.
According to Dr. William D. Edwards, in an article written about Jesus' death in the Journal of the American Medical Association, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge.
Similarly, New Testament scholar and historian John Dominic Crossan writes that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be.
Okay, then what about the third option? If the disciples were neither deceived nor deceivers, then perhaps they were just deluded. Some have tried to argue this, that the disciples merely hallucinated Jesus' resurrection.
And obviously a hallucination theory could explain how it's possible that certain people would individually believe that they had seen someone come back from the dead. However, the problem with this theory is that even though it could account for appearances to individuals, it can't plausibly account for Jesus' appearances to groups, because hallucinations are not a group phenomenon. They're private experiences whose contents can't be shared between multiple individuals, especially if the contents are detailed. And as New Testament scholars Gerd Thiessen and Annette Mertz point out, the appearances of Jesus to the disciples as a group are solidly attested in multiple sources.
Therefore, we see in light of the alternative explanations for these minimal or bedrock facts that there is only one explanation which plausibly fits the evidence, and that is that Jesus Christ really did rise from the dead as he said he would.
British scholar N.T. Wright states, "I have examined all the alternative explanations, ancient and modern, for the rise of the early church, and I have to say that far and away the best historical explanation is that Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead."
Of course, someone might try to argue that they don't even need to consider the historical evidence because they just know that they know that they know that miracles are impossible and people don't rise from the dead.
But consider the following illustration given by a judge in the highest court in the UK in 2008 to explain the power of evidence to change our preconceived notions about what is and is not probable. Bearing in mind, judges think about probability and evidence a lot. And in this memorable illustration, the judge explains that if a man walking in Regent's Park in London claims to have seen a lion, then hardly anyone would believe him because in all probability he was mistaken. It was probably just a big dog. However, if further evidence is brought to light that the lion's cage at London Zoo, which is next to Regent's Park, is open, and that there is no lion in the cage, as there should be, then as incredible as it seems, it is probably now the case that the man did indeed see a lion. In other words, that he wasn't lion.
That's a really bad joke.
You're right, that's
sorry.
a bad joke. What I meant to say was, in other words, the circumstantial evidence has rendered what would normally be hugely improbable now very probable indeed.
As a lawyer by background, I think you really like that illustration, don't you?
I really do. Because the moral of the illustration is, if you're really interested in getting to know the truth, You can't just ignore the evidence. And so good historians, like good lawyers, should be willing to go wherever the evidence leads. And as we've seen, when we consider the minimal or bedrock facts agreed to by the strong majority of New Testament scholars and historians, whether Christian, atheist, agnostic, or whatever, and when we consider the various alternative explanations available to explain these remarkable facts, we see that the historical evidence lies overwhelmingly in support of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead.
Well, thank you so much for journeying with us in this session and the last, as we've looked together at the question, is it true? We really hope these sessions have helped you to see that there are plenty of good reasons to believe, not just in God, but in the God of the Bible revealed to us through Jesus. And that these are reasons that are accessible not just to believers, but to everyone. And so we hope that this has helped you to think about these things in relation to your own faith, as well as how you might talk to your friends about it. In our next session, we will turn from the question, is it true, to consider another primary motivating question, is it good?
This has been Confident Faith, Apologetics for Everyone. It's been great having you.
See you next time.